Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz. I am Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and on behalf of Jane Harmon, the Director and President of the Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you here to the Wilson Center for today's event. I have always pleased to cooperate and work with the Rule of Law Collaborative, and this is, I think, the 5th time that we've held a conference together. But one of my areas of focus at the Kennan Institute is on the rule of law, and I head up the Kennan Institute's Rule of Law program. The rule of law is virtually always included in any to-do list for countries around the world. Yet while we have a clear idea about the endpoint, getting there usually proves to be more difficult than originally believed. And I study Russia, so I can assure you that my daily activities, I often wonder when we're even going to get to the halfway point. But anyway, multiple approaches have been tried to achieve this objective and firmly establish the rule of law. And today we are going to focus on the question of how to promote and sustain a key ingredient of the rule of law, and that is the independent judiciary. In organizing today's program, our goal is to provide alternative approaches that can engage both the on-the-ground practitioner and the scholar in helping to develop rule of law programs and promoting the independent judiciary. And so we're looking forward to having a very collaborative event today and involving everybody as we move forward. As I said, this is the 5th meeting that we have hosted with Joel Samuels and the Rule of Law Collaborative at the University of South Carolina. They have been great partners and continue to do excellent and innovative work in this area. Just a brief note about the Just Track program. Just Track is the cooperative program of the Rule of Law Collaborative of the University of South Carolina and the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Just Track seeks to improve the skills and knowledge of individuals funding, designing, managing, and implementing justice sector programs in post-conflict and transitional states. It further provides a multitude of stakeholders the opportunity to share their experiences and lessons regarding justice sector programming. And that is what we intend to do today. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Joel. And again, welcome to the Wilson Center.
Good morning, everyone. In South Carolina, there's always a response when I do that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joel Samuels. I'm the director of the Rule of Law Collaborative. It's a pleasure for me to see so many familiar faces and to see some new faces. One of the great joys of the ongoing Just Track program, which with today's event begins its 4th year, is to see so many returning faces. It's a sign that our programs matter and have an impact, and we are thrilled to see so many of you back and hope that the newcomers will find substantive value in today's event and will return for future programs. I want to begin by thanking Will and the Wilson Center for continuing to work with the Rule of Law Collaborative and Just Track to support these important events and to be such easy partners to work with. So thank you very much, Will. I also want to thank our partners at the Department of State, led by Judith J.J. Welling and Andrew Bueller, for their continued support and the partnership that is the Just Track Cooperative Agreement. This symposium focuses on a topic that is covered fairly regularly, the question of how do we strengthen judiciaries. What we hope will be a little bit different is the focus specifically on practical approaches to strengthening judicial institutions. So taking a very practical lens and thinking about ways that judicial institutions can be strengthened. And this is an activity of the Just Track program, which Will mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And I want to take just a couple of minutes for those of you who are new to Just Track, just to talk a little bit about what Just Track aims to do and does. The primary mission of Just Track is to work with particularly USG personnel to strengthen their capacity for those who are involved in rule of law programming around the world. But that, as you see, is not restricted to the U.S. government. One of the important pieces that we as an academic center try to bring to the table is connecting the network of the complex network and thicket of rule of law actors from civil society, the private sector, government, U.S. government, foreign governments, and the international community, international governmental organizations. We accomplish this primarily through 4 activities. Quarterly trainings that are held here in Washington. Those are intended primarily for USG audience, though when we don't reach capacity, we open it to non-USG participants. Those trainings vary in style. Some are focused on introductory rule of law principles for those who are newer to the concept. And so in November of this year, we'll host a training focused on introductory rule of law principles. And then some are focused on advanced concepts in rule of law. This year, we've just completed a program that my colleague Hamid Khan put on, focused on Islamic law and rule of law. And in January, we'll host a program focused on civil law principles and rule of law, for example. We also host, as you know, symposia like the one today. We host 3 symposia a year, 2 here in Washington, 1 abroad. The Foreign Symposium is a closed-door Chatham House Rules symposium in which we invite regional experts to discuss an issue of particular importance to that region. In March, we hosted an event focused on youth and the rule of law in sub-Saharan Africa that brought together 45 leaders from across the continent who deal with youth issues from, again, all of the perspectives I spoke about earlier: government, civil society, private sector. Although those events are closed door, we produce a white paper out of those events with a series of recommendations that are available on our website. So I encourage you, if you find that topic or are interested in some of our other topics, for example, countering violent extremism and the rule of law. This spring we'll host an event on wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia. You'll see that one of the themes of our events is not to bring together, generally speaking, the same players to have the same conversations that are happening. We try to bring in new conversations. Our very first event here at the Wilson Center focused on environment and the rule of law, for example. The third thing we do is to develop a network of rule of law actors. We do that through a website, www.justtrack.org. It's probably in your various materials and in a sign just to the left here. And a quarterly newsletter that by participating you will be registered for if you want to get out. I've spent the last several weeks trying to unsubscribe from various things, so if for some reason you're not interested in being on that, we will happily take you off. But we find we've gotten tremendous feedback on our quarterly newsletters that profile not only the activities of Just Track, but also give some practitioner profiles and talk about recent developments in rule of law literature. And finally, networking opportunities here. Today, we will have a specific time set aside at lunch in which we hope you'll use to network and get to know other attendees, to get a sense of some of the other people here in the room, both speakers and other people who've come to participate. And finally, we engage in research on the rule of law on issues of relevance to justice sector actors. As to today's event, there's probably no issue more central to supporting the rule of law than understanding the role of the judiciary and ways to strengthen judicial institutions. For those of you who've worked in fragile developing states, and I imagine in this room that's quite a few of you, we understand how difficult it is to accomplish this mission. It's not for a lack of effort and it's not for a lack of funding. It is a complex series of issues that constrain our efforts to strengthen judicial institutions, and they vary from state to state, from context to context, and at times from regime to regime. The goal of today's event is to consider several central topics to strengthening judicial institutions. We'll use a conversational panel format to accomplish that goal. So we'll have a moderator for each session, but the moderator will participate in the conversation, and the goal, as we've spoken with all of the panelists in the weeks leading up to this event, will really be to engage in a conversation among the panelists, to engage each other and you in that conversation, and to save time for Q&A where you can be involved in the conversation as well. The experts today bring a broad range of experiences from a variety of different viewpoints: government, private sector, civil society, to discuss both specific issues related to strengthening judicial institutions, and at the same time to consider the role of non-governmental actors in our final panel of the day in the process of strengthening judicial institutions. One theme of today, if I can tease one out, is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this question. So today I encourage you to look for other broad themes, but also to look for individual nuggets within the experiences of our panelists and speakers from their experiences across a range of different countries around the world confronting these issues. As I mentioned, there will be opportunities for networking throughout the day, including lunch and the various breaks. I encourage you to take advantage of them. And we'll end by a closing keynote by Chief Justice Jilani of Pakistan, who we're honored to have with us here today. He'll be here throughout the day. So I encourage you to introduce yourself and speak with him, and we're really honored to have you with us here, Chief Justice. In your packets, you'll find information on the speaker bios. That's included in part so that our panelists can jump right in and we don't have to spend a lot of time introducing our speakers, so our moderators can get right into the conversation. So I encourage you with each panel to familiarize yourself with who will be speaking. And finally, I must end by reminding you of the neon green sheets in your packets, the bright green evaluation forms as part of this cooperative agreement. It's important to us to get feedback on your experiences so that we can continue to grow and build in our future programming. With that, I welcome you all to this event, and I invite our first panel to the dais. And we look forward to a wonderful day with you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Right, my name is Suren Avanesian. I'm a senior advisor in the United States Agency for International Development. Welcome, everyone, to our panel on judicial independence. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Wilson Center, Rule of Law Collaborative, Will Pomeranz, Joel, and everybody else who prepared this phenomenal event. And also to thank our panel here. We have a very distinguished panel. We have a federal judge, Vicky Miles-LaGrange. We have a former judge from Georgia, Inga Tadria, who now is working on one of our signature rule of law activities in the Republic of Georgia. And I would like to introduce Dr. Jan van Zyl-Smit, who is a rule of law expert and at this moment works with the Bingham Center in England. The topic that we're going to cover in the next hour and a half is incredibly complex. There are a lot of things that go into judicial independence, and we will not be able to cover all of those things today. However, we will try to be comprehensive. We will try to do as much as we can to delve in as many issues as possible. And of course, looking into judicial independence from the perspective of developing that overseas with the foreign assistance and so forth. Now, it's important, I think, to set a context for what we're going to be discussing. Rule of law, judicial independence, is an ideal. It's an ideal similar to rule of law ideal, democracy ideal, and so forth. There are some attributes that we associate with judicial independence, but it's also important to think of a context in which judicial independence exists. Okay, and it's important, especially when we think of the environments where we work in. Judicial independence is a part of a larger phenomenon, right? It's usually considered to be a part of what we call constitutional democracy or liberal democracy. And the two often really cannot be separated, and that should be kept in mind as we go through this in the next hour plus. Constitutionalism basically implies three different things. One is separation of powers, is judicial independence, and there's the rule of law. And each one of those requires probably hours and hours and hours and years and years and years of discussions to unwrap those concepts. But it's important to keep that in the context because judicial independence basically means that we have three co-equal branches of government. Rule of law means that there's some form of societal consensus on the social norms, and we'll get into this later, but there needs to be a consensus in the society. that society is going to accept impartial judiciary, independent judiciary. And that's an important part of that equation. Judicial independence cannot exist in a vacuum. Now, as rule of law practitioners, we will talk today a lot about institutional guarantees and procedural guarantees of judicial independence and what it actually means from the development point of view. How can we support judicial independence in various countries and so forth? So that can become a very technical discussion, and it will be a very technical discussion because it is geared towards the practitioners and is by the practitioners. But I do encourage you to keep that other context in mind. My other title in USAID is a democracy officer. So when I work on the rule of law, on anti-corruption, two areas that I cover, I look at this areas as a democracy specialist. And that does add a whole different twist to this discussion. Now, I would like to open this panel by asking a very general and open-ended question. I don't have any particular order in mind, so whoever wants to take it first, please. What are the most important characteristics of an independent judiciary? As judge, former judge, and rule of law practitioner, what would you consider to be the most important characteristics of independent judiciary? Who wants to start?
I'll take a beginning at it.
Thank you.
I believe that in general, judicial independence is the concept that the judiciary actually needs to be kept away from the other branches of government. It creates the kind of autonomy that must be a part of the process if it is going to be effective at all. Certainly, courts, to be effective, I think, they cannot be subject to improper influences from the other branches of our government. I think that was clearly intended as it developed. But they should not be subject to improper influences from the other branches of government, or from private or partisan interest. And my colleague said she gets pretty rigid about that. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that's what was intended, so the courts could function mm-hmm. as they should. It's vital, I believe, and it's important to that notion of the separation of powers. Why? Because courts should not in any way be influenced in that way. So those are just some cursory thoughts mm-hmm. Of my own and belief about the system mm-hmm. of our three co-equal independent branches of our government.
Thank you, Judge. Inga, would you like to?
Shall I switch on?
It's on.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for your interest in this such an important topic I've been working for years on, and I've been asking to myself the same question many times, and whenever I start thinking of responses, then I'm asking myself why it's so important to think about judicial independence, why it's so vital, as Judge mentioned, why it's so important, why so much resources, money, efforts are spent in a number of countries and by donors to accomplish this, why it's so important, and for the sake of what is so important. And I mean, because in a number of countries, at least in constitutions, it's declared principle of separation of power. And as Suren mentioned, these three branches of co-equal co-equal branches. I like this expression, co-equal. And I was thinking to myself that, okay, so in Georgia as well as in many of new emerged democracies, constitutional provision separates power between executive, legislature, and judicial branch, but nobody asked question about independence of executives or legislators. So there is no problem. So what's wrong with judiciary, or why it should be protected, why it should be well thought and discussed all the time. It's never-ending process of thinking, rethinking, reforming, and etc. So, and I thought to myself, okay, they are equal, of course, and co-equal, but some of them are more equal, perhaps. I mean, that came to my mind, because legislators have a very strong instrument in their hands. They can draft legislation and then can say, like, for instance, recently we approved very new constitution since 1994. So, or executive, they have money. They have money, and they can give money either judiciary judges and provide and allocate enough sufficient resources or not. So these two branches of government seem to me more powerful, more equal, because they have some basis. What has judiciary? Judiciary must have also some power, and there is trust, perhaps, which comes from society, which empowers judiciary. In order to gain this trust, there is then this, actually, we shall think about judicial independence, which is not for the sake of judges. I used to be judge, and maybe at some point I thought, oh my God, it's good for me, it benefits myself. No, that is not right. It's not for the sake of judges to promote judicial independence. That is for the sake of those for whom judges deliver justice, for individuals who want to see fair trial, fair treatment, equal treatment, and want to protection their rights. So from this point of view, I believe that's very important aspect of judicial independence to understand, and this understanding shall be, and everyone shall be at the same page, executives, legislators, civil society, and judiciary itself, that's what is the purpose of judicial independence, why it should be protected, and why it should be safeguarded. That is in order to protect and to implement rule of law in these countries. Of course, judges also need this independence, but maybe later on we will discuss, it's about this aspect as well. So, maybe I did not respond directly to your question, but that was, thank you.
Thank you. Can I start just by very briefly thanking Just Track for the invitation and the Wilson Center for hosting me as part of the panel. It's an interesting experience to be talking about strengthening judicial institutions here in Washington, D.C., home to probably the world's strongest court, most influential, or among the most influential in the world in its national politics as well. Judicial independence, I think it's interesting that we're talking in this setting in a strong judicial system about what to do in countries where judicial independence needs strengthening. And I think we can locate it now in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's worth looking at these just to remember how basic and how necessary judicial independence is. The Sustainable Development Goals finally recognize that there is something about legal systems that needs to be included in development, and they, as you know, included access to justice. Now, to my mind, judicial independence is a necessary part of access to justice. And what it means, I think, has been well covered by my two colleagues on the panel. So I'll just say this. If the judicial function in a constitutional system is to give final decisions on questions of law, and what questions of law are varies a lot between countries. Here we have the broad constitutional sphere. Other countries, the UK where I'm based, give less to the courts. But whatever their sphere, the courts are to give final rulings on these legal questions. So an independent judiciary is one which does its job in giving those final rulings impartially, without influence from the government. And then, as Judge Todria just said, the various safeguards, which I think we'll spend most of the session talking about, are not there in the first place for the judges, but to help the judiciary as an institution perform that task of impartial adjudication.
Well, thank you very much. Speaking of the, well, now that we know what impartiality means, it's basically freedom from external interference, right? Freedom of an individual judge and freedom of the judiciary as an institution. What are the most important guarantees, be that institutional or procedural? How do we guarantee that independence? How do we make sure that the judges remain independent? What comes to mind first? Or second?
Well, one thing I would probably say is there is no accountability if there is no judicial independence. They cannot survive. It cannot survive without it.
Yep.
Kind of a thought.
Thank you.
The one protection that I would begin with is tenure in judicial office. And I think I could tell a historical story there. So in the English legal system, tenure was established more than 300 years ago. Most of the other safeguards that will likely come up in a discussion such as this have not been in legal form until quite recently in the British legal system. There have been all kinds of informal understandings and practices which are now in legal form, as they are in most other countries, but simply for judges to have an appointment which they don't have to seek to have renewed, for me is the most important starting point. And also, I would add, because we'll talk a lot about trust here, it's important from the perspective of litigants. A litigant who sees a judge that might have to please somebody to get reappointed will see those potential conflicts of interest. So I think that's a big step forward on the trust side as well.
I can list number of, safeguard-related, dimensions in regards to protection of judicial, how to ensure independence of judiciary as an institution and independence of individual judges. But speaking of, external interference and how to safeguard judiciary from external interference, and speaking of Georgia example, I would come up to idea to have individuals of integrity and high competence as judges in the judiciary, well educated and of high integrity, because in order to oppose external interference, which always will be at place. I mean, I cannot imagine the world that's when executive, legislators, media, or parties won't have interest to interference courts. Of course, that is why they exist. They want their own interest to be protected, and they don't necessarily have very good education, or not necessarily are obliged to, to safeguard judicial independence. They want their own good. So this interference will exist in various forms. So in order to oppose this interference, you need to have judges with inner independence within the courts. What is the biggest problem for Georgia and perhaps in other maybe developing countries? Human resources, because only 25 years. It's 1/4 century we've been working on democracy and improving. In strengthening judicial independence of Georgia. Is it much? From one side, for myself, for my personal life path, it's of course lots of years,
well,
and
years
I would like to have it yesterday. But done, everything accomplished. But for the history, it's very short period of time. So we've been doing this. So, and we have the same human resources almost. We don't have now absolutely new generation, which would take seat and, it's oppose this. We'll have good education, as we say normally in Georgia, Western educated people are good for us. So sometimes it's also not necessary. So it's about judges, their inner independence, their integrity levels, and so human resources, I would
Thank
say.
you, Inge. There were a couple of things that were mentioned here that perhaps need to be explored in greater detail. The question of judicial tenure. And that's something that we hear all the time. What is better? Is it term appointment? Is it life appointment? If you appoint a judge for 10 years versus if you appoint a judge for the rest of his or her life, does that make a judge an independent? Does it make a huge difference? And in our system, as we all know, we have term appointments, we have life appointments, and we tend to consider our system to be independent and rule of law compliant.
I think I could probably make a persuasive argument for the life tenure. I think the wording of the applicable part of the Constitution says that federal judges shall be judges for life or so long as they shall have good behavior. And good behavior, in quotes, could equate into any number of things. And that's really the stopping point, if you will, where it becomes potentially it could become totally unproductive, and nobody in this room wants an unproductive judge, and that could be interpreted many ways as well, I think. But I think that that would be, I'll stop with that for now.
As we know, in a number of Eastern European nations, former communist countries, life tenure basically became a signature prescription. In many constitutions, in many judicial laws, judges are now, it's stipulated that judges are appointed for life. However, we've seen, as Will pointed out in case of Russia, that they're still struggling with very basic concepts of fairness, judicial independence, there's still interference of the executive branch and so forth. In many countries, we've seen that. So that creates an interesting dilemma. Going back to the issue of integrity and what it actually takes for a judge to be a judge, that kind of goes to the question of selection, right? How do we select judges? How do we ensure that the right people end up in the system? And then, of course, the second part of this question, how do we make sure that once they're in the system, they continue to behave? And I know that Jan had some experience with judicial vetting. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit. And of course, the question of Georgia and this massive judicial, let's call them reappointments, a number of years ago, and new judges coming into the system. I'd be curious to know what came out of that experience 10, 15 years later. Jan, do you want to say?
Yes, that covers a lot. So if I can begin just with selection in normal times, perhaps not when a system is being restarted, for want of a better word, when there's a constitutional transition. In normal times, the goal has to be, as both judges have said, to find individuals of integrity and competence, and beyond that, also reflective of the society they serve to further strengthen trust. And I just want to, in the spirit of sharing experience, comment on the trends in the jurisdictions that I've studied most, which are the Commonwealth countries, 50 or so countries formerly colonized in different ways by Britain, and sharing common law legal systems with a few exceptions. So the tradition there, which will be familiar here from the federal judiciary, is for the executive to tap judges. The British tradition doesn't have parliamentary confirmation, but that model has evolved in the large majority of Commonwealth states. It's evolved in two ways. The one is to introduce commissions, which are like their civil law counterparts, judicial councils, bodies that bring together a range of different people for various reasons which we could discuss. A good proportion should, in most cases, be judges, but then there can be representatives of the bar, lay people with background in recruitment, and various others who bring skills to the exercise. So that's one trend, the councils or commissions. But just as important, and I think more often overlooked, is the change from the tap power, which in the immediate independence era in countries where a commission was set up by the departing British authorities, so in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean in the 1960s, it was still commissions tapping new people, so still a closed system. And that really doesn't create the kind of confidence within the legal community for everyone to feel that they have an opportunity to aspire to becoming a judge, to plan a career, to become a judge, build up the right experience, and so on. So the more recent development is that there are open application processes, open to all, and sometimes with interviews open to the public for legitimacy. And that's something South Africa introduced, Kenya, a few other countries. So little by little, these systems have approached something like the full glare of Senate confirmation hearings, at least in that. But that we reserve that for the Supreme Court level. I'm conscious I've talked quite a lot. We could either pause there and come back to vetting, or I could explain just how vetting is different.
Well, let's pause for a moment and we'll come back to that important topic, because as you know, a lot of places, for example, Ukraine today, and then Bosnia, Kosovo, and then Georgia and other places have gone through those experiences. The countries I'm most familiar with, and of course Africa. Ingrid, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, of course, one of the safeguards of judicial independence is, selection process of judges, and it should be merit-based, of course. And in Georgia, I mean, 3 different governments initiated reforms which actually made changes in exactly judicial selection appointment rules, and there were also different approaches how to replace corrupt judges with individuals of integrity or more competent judges. So, I mean, we went through 3 different types of approaches. First was that, first reform was mainly focused, and I'm speaking of judicial selection appointment, mainly focused on competence of judges, and also, background check of judges. And it started back in Shevardnadze era when the new Democrats like Saakashvili, Zhvania were by that time members of parliament and persuaded the Soviet Shevardnadze to do something with corrupt judges. The system was entirely corrupted. So, and mainly reform was by that time concentrated focus on judicial qualification examination. But not many judges were able to pass this examination. And this reform actually, during this reform, a number of judges were replaced by new judges who were able to pass the exam. Those who did not pass judicial qualification examination, they were dismissed from the judiciary. They were removed from the judiciary. Their term was terminated prior to expiration of this term. That was one experience. Actually, this reform to some point failed in Georgia. Of course, there are long-term consequences of this because new judges, new faces also came up to the judiciary, better judges, not corrupted judges. So, but from the other side, because this reform did not cut other areas, and so the whole environments maintained very corrupt. So and also there were no enough sufficient human resources who would fulfill these positions and pass judicial examination or again present individuals like with the integrity. So there is deficit of this kind of individuals in post-Soviet countries. So of course then the second government decided to keep working on this reform again on selection appointment of judges, and the same guys actually were the Saakashvili who was during Shevardnadze, and then they conducted more aggressive reform. They just kicked out judges from the benches because in number of instances it was said that judges were told to sign signature resignation letters. They resigned. For instance, out of 37 Supreme Court judges in the beginning after the Rose Revolution, more than 20 signed resignation letters. They resigned. But those who rejected resignation, so they were disciplined, and 9 of them, including current Chief Justice of Georgia, who just came back to the bench afterwards. And 9 judges were prosecuted. And basics for prosecution was a lawful decision. So these rules all the time changing.
Well, thank you, Inga. That actually brings up an important question. It's the process, right? How the selection is being done, who is in charge of the selection, what institutions are put in place to make sure that as the judges are being selected, that appearance of independence is being maintained. Now, one of the solutions, and Jan talked about it a moment ago, is to create this independent commissions or judicial councils, which we've seen in Latin America, we've seen it in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. The bodies that are separate from the executive branch are independent and who have the mandate to select the judges and in some instances appoint them. Is that perhaps a way to have a system where we can have judges selected carefully, but also a system where we show respect to the judiciary and the judges, right? By arbitrarily dismissing them or doing something that basically paints every judge in the system as corrupt, and we've seen that in a number of countries. You're discrediting the institution. And while you're at the same time trying to create this new judiciary that will be impartial, independent, and so forth, however, the institution itself has been damaged by the way you have done the selection process. So what could be a solution here? And we have a number of examples out there. Jan, do you want to maybe go back to the issue of councils and commissions and see how that works and if that's successful and what we learned from that over the years?
Yes, thank you. So the two types of councils or bodies we could be talking about here. I think one is the permanent body put in place. The other is perhaps a temporary body to carry out some kind of exercise looking at the existing judiciary. So should I focus on one or the other for now? Let me talk about permanent bodies then, and we can come back to transitional situations. Permanent judicial councils or commissions could have a range of responsibilities. Selection of judges is just one. Another is discipline, and another is management of the court system to the extent that that's a judicial function and not also shared with government. Some countries combine all those functions in the hands of one council. Some have separate councils, either permanent or, in the case of discipline, sometimes ad hoc, formed when there is an investigation. So we've got to be careful when we compare those different bodies. Then there's the question of who the members should be. And I think it's important to think about where each country is before it establishes a body like that. So system most people think of is a system where the power starts, as I mentioned in the British tradition, in the executive government, a power to tap judges, and that power is then passed to the judiciary to strengthen the judiciary in that way. And then one can see that judges, if they have control of the council, would be able to resist pressure to choose people who are politically aligned with the government and so on. And that in a way is quite straightforward, and the others are there for balance and for experience of who the candidates are, so that the judges don't just appoint their own friends and associates. So that's one story, but in fact that's not the story that's happened in many countries. So the two other examples I want to talk about are Latin America and India, and they have this in common. So several Latin American countries have had the civil law tradition of the Supreme Court selecting judges for the other courts and its own members. And the introduction of judicial councils there from the 1990s onwards was an attempt to open that up so that it wouldn't be a closed system. That's not necessarily strengthening the judiciary. One has to bear that in mind. And in India, something similar has occurred. The Indian Supreme Court, or its most senior members, have been responsible since the 1980s for choosing all other judges in the higher courts. And 2 years ago, India amended its constitution to introduce one of these councils where only half of the members would be judges, but the Indian Supreme Court rejected that constitutional amendment. So it's a much longer conversation, the pros and cons of these different approaches, but I just want us to be aware that the countries start from different places. The Indian Supreme Court issued a 1,000-page judgment to justify what it was doing, but the gist of the judgment seemed to be that if there were other members on the council, and if the judges alone couldn't decide who the new judges would be, then the judges would have to bargain with these other members. And in a very roundabout way, the court implied that any non-judicial members would be proxies for political parties in the reality of Indian politics at the time, and that therefore judicial independence would be threatened by that. So it's interesting, and I think the 1,000 pages are interesting, that judges sometimes will go to such lengths to explain why their system is not ready for a particular type of council. So it's a very long way of saying that without even looking at the transitional situation, one needs different solutions for different countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, and I certainly will add that decision to my reading list. 1,000 pages, that certainly is impressive. It beats Tolstoy and War and Peace right there.
Yeah.
Inga, actually, speaking of the judicial councils and what happened in Georgia several years ago, when we basically had a high judicial council where all the members were judges, right? Majority. And then we now have a council where there are some non-judicial members, right?
Correct.
Academics or members of the bar and so
Right,
forth.
right.
Do you see an appreciable and noticeable difference in the way the council operates now vis-a-vis what it was, say, several years ago?
The councils for the judiciary, of course, it's not the only solution. First of all, I would echo your point. You mentioned U.S. experience and say that, judges are elected, judges are appointed, or whatever, it works. So, but this kind of countries like Georgia is, in order to escape from executive somehow, or the Ministry of Justice, these councils for judiciary, there is experience and it works better as practice shows. Currently, we have in Georgia High Council of Justice for judiciary, which composed of 15 members. Out of 15 members, 9 non-judges, so big majority. 9 non-judges, including ex-officio Chief Justice. And 6 are elected based on engagement, active participation from law society and civil society, because they currently, after this, just recently got this right in 2013 to nominate their candidates to the Council for the judiciary. So, and now we have a voice also of civil society, legal professionals, High Council of Justice. They can represent them, and they can work together with judges in order to make the process of judicial selection maybe better, because it's not about only closing the system only in the hands of judges. There are some countries which experience Council for the Judiciary, which 100% composes of judges. In Georgia, there is big majority. From one side it's positive to have a majority of judges. From the other side, they can be very protective and cooperative in making decisions, and so there is this kind of threat as well. So speaking of councils for the judiciary, it's important in order to ensure then objective selection and appointment of judges, not based on personal preferences of other arrangements and negotiations between these 15 members of High Council of Justice, to have at first place members of High Council of Justice selected and appointed to their seats based on rigorous selection process. So in order to select judges properly, we need first to select High Council of Justice members properly. We just introduced this kind of design of High Council of Justice with representation of public, and I think that it would make sense for civil society to educate better or to be more active in nominating candidates and to look better into background of these candidates, and I mean to nominate candidates which are really also themselves independent and won't speak out on behalf of political parties or based on their personal preferences. Civil society concerned in regards of Georgia and High Council of Justice in number of instances when it goes to selection appointment is about bargaining process between judge members, non-judge members, and still the same judges are appointed and reappointed. So the same judges which we are in the past called notaries or prosecutors approving their verdicts, their requests, for instance. So there are no new judges coming to the judiciary. So despite the fact that there is improvement in design of High Council of Justice, improvement in legislation, so we need to think what next should be done also in order to ensure really objective selection of judges.
That's great. That's a very good point. So speaking of what else needs to be in place, maybe Judge Abganj can help us with that. We often talk about the issue of performance evaluation. How do you evaluate the performance of a judge? What are the standards that we should be using, or the judiciary should be using? Who should be evaluating the judges? In some of the systems in continental Europe and the former Soviet Union, often the Ministry of Justice is the evaluator, and that's a part of the executive branch, right? The standards themselves, how do they get formulated? What is the basis for that evaluation? What, in your opinion, is the most important thing that should be out there to determine how a judge performs his or her duties, and who should be doing that evaluation? And then what are the consequences of a judge, say, not performing adequately? What are the safeguards and what we have in place to guarantee that the performance perhaps can be improved at the same time that judicial independence is preserved in the process and it doesn't become that overly politicized, externally driven process?
I guess I think that certainly having lawyers be a part of that evaluation is a must-do, the way I see it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they have to exclude that group of individuals have to be exclusively lawyers, but I think lawyers are a critical part of an evaluation of that nature. I think that, well, maybe I don't really think that. I won't even go there on that point. But I know that, but I don't mean to the exclusion of a lay person, but I think the job description needs to be very well considered, evaluated, because the judges are not just judges for a particular group of people, but to people who have sought the system to correct a wrong, or to, so it's really, it's almost painfully critical that consideration be given to every aspect possible in a effective way, identifying an effective way to evaluate that.
Yeah.
Because every time I hear that, I think, well, we all could probably do a little better in that process. I mean, I think it deserves quite a deliberation about what should that evaluation look like.
Yeah. But do you think it should be primarily driven by the lawyers, and what would be or by the judges, and then what would be the incentives for the judges to actually comply with performance standards? So long as you're in good behavior, are there incentives for the judges to comply with those standards?
I mean, I think that's the essence of the question.
Yeah.
It really is. And there's probably room for good consideration. When I say good consideration that really effectively, nobody in their right mind wants a jurist that is going to be ineffective, or I think education and training is certainly a major part of it. In the industry, if you will, for lack of a better word. But it's an interesting concept to develop those lights that we take a very critical look at. Because that could even be, there's no industry out here that can't improve, and certainly lawyers are not exempt from that. But I think it's very interesting, I think.
I think the question of independence and accountability has it's an interesting balance to think about. Because on the one side, especially in, say, the countries that are transitioning from communism, or from various types of authoritarian or totalitarian or whatever autocratic regimes, and you're creating this institution that is independent, that's supposed to be independent, there's still a question of accountability, democratic accountability. And that's a balance, because if you're emerging from a system where the judges really were an extension of the executive branch, say in the Soviet Union or Imperial Russia, and Will can tell you anything and everything about it, where you essentially have one player in the justice system, and that's the prosecutor or procurator, a person who is vested with the ultimate authority when it comes to enforcing the law or actually defining the parameters of the law. Judicial independence becomes an interesting conundrum. And often what I've seen in my practice and work overseas is that judges tend to think, once they think of the idea of independence, say in the former Soviet Union, they almost think of it as absolute. And it comes as a big surprise that, well, it really is not, that there's still this issue of accountability, right? But defining it becomes incredibly painful, right? Because there's this governance element of it, but also this is external accountability, and finding a careful balance is difficult. Part of it is budgets, and someone mentioned budgets maybe 20 minutes ago. That is one way to influence the judiciary, right? That's the tool that the executive branch can use to influence the judiciary. And if we were to combine the permanent councils and the administration of justice and the budgets, what would be that ideal scheme where you have the judiciary that is independent, can administer itself without external influences, and have adequate budgetary needs? And then the question, of course, how do you define adequate in this situation? And who wants to take it?
It's important. Yeah.
Jan, do you want to go first?
Yes, so a few different questions there. And one could ask, well, what measures are the judiciary being held accountable to? From the things you've covered, at least two very different kinds of measures spring to mind. The one is the quality of the decisions, and the other is efficiency, really. So whether justice is done reasonably promptly, or whether cases get delayed very badly. So I think the mechanisms to address those two challenges are probably very different. On the quality of decisions, lawyers and judges can usually defend their system quite well by saying that appeals are the route to getting the quality of your decision checked as best the system can do that. So appeals, published reasoned judgments, open hearings. I mean, just going over very, very commonplace things. And courts have to resist periodically in different places the claims that there should be some external body set up to correct their decisions. That's often a sign of authoritarianism. And the latest proposals in Poland, for instance, will bring in lay people to be part of extraordinary complaints against court decisions. So that's one example. But when it comes to the second area, the area of efficiency, it seems to me that that's an area where the courts can collaborate sensibly with the other branches of government, because it's easier to be objective about court processing times and so on. And while the judges may not always have the expertise to run all the budgeting themselves, they need to be part of a system which works together to reduce those targets. And it should be recognized that the judiciary needs more funding when those targets are not being met. That's broadly. Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting in the United States, in the federal court system, we have an administrative office of the United States courts, right, and this judicial conference. And then within the federal judiciary, we have Federal Judicial Center, which is essentially the think tank, right, that helps the judiciary to come up with various performance standards that the judges can apply to evaluate their overall performance. At the state level, we have a similar body. It's called NCSC, National Center for State Courts, and then associations like NACM and others, court administrators and managers, etc. So there's a body of sometimes federally funded, sometimes state funded, sometimes not-for-profits. The American Bar Association, for example, comes up with the trial court performance standards, right? So it's a combination of NGOs, like civil society types of organizations, and the government that kind of helps the judiciary to navigate that terrain of performance, what it actually means to have a well-performing and effective and efficient judiciary. In the development context, however, we're missing that often, right? And coming up with those performance standards becomes extremely controversial, right? Because it is often the judges who have that task. And then if you come from a system that emphasized quotas, right? How many cases you decide every day, every month, every year, and so forth, and you're being judged, the performance is being evaluated based on that, your disposition rate, essentially. That becomes problematic, right? Because then as a judge, you may tend to emphasize easier cases versus more complex cases. You're under the pressure to perform, and you're being disciplined for that. In some instances, and in the former Soviet Union, we've seen that often, judge's opinion could be a basis for disciplinary action, right? A judge could be accused of misapplying the law, and that can be considered as basis for punishment, essentially. So it's a dilemma that we have to think about.
May I contribute to
Yes, please.
financial? I mean, yeah. My colleague talked about financial resources and allocation of financial resources to courts from the angle of and perspective of efficiency of justice and management. Of course, that is the very right and very true. I would like to more focus on these as a tool to safeguard judicial independence, because it's so important to allocate courts, allocate proper number of courts, proper number of courtrooms, proper number of judges, and proper number of court staff, also supportive staff. Otherwise, if you have lack of judges, if you have heavy case log and case delays, of course, that can cause very good background for those who are in charge of punishment of judges to initiate disciplinary cases against judges, and it can work against the principle of independence of the individual judge, who tends to make more mistakes when he's overwhelmed with the cases and busy all the time and had no time to read and to advance his knowledge and to grow up as a lawyer. So it's pretty big dilemma and problem. For one side, of course, it's about efficiency of justice. We need more efficient justice. From the other side, we should see here also when governments does not allocate properly financial resources to the courts. In some instances, it can be done on purpose. In some instances, governments can really have lack of resources, and that can be the problem. But my observation is that government pretty good is aware about importance of financial allocation, and the courts, as in comparison with executives, legislators, they don't need so much money. I mean, at least in this kind of small country as Georgia is, we have only currently 286 judges, including Supreme Court judges. And I mean, for a country like Georgia, I think the government can take burden and to allocate sufficient. So right now, as a project, for instance, we are assisting High Council of Justice of Georgia to develop methodology to how to identify this proper or adequate, resource, in order to define how many courts do they need, how many judges, clerks, and then go to the government, to the Minister of Finance with, empirical data, very well-reasoned requests for rising or to providing proper resources to them. So it's very important to safeguard judicial independence as well. So that's what I wanted to add.
Judge.
I think one of the risks that is always involved, I look at, for example, our court. It was about 80 years before a woman would be a federal judge in Oklahoma. It was probably less than 10 years, more than that, that someone not a majority of the population would have that ability to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes even, it raises it to even a higher level of, you want,
Mm-hmm.
the hope is that, okay, qualification, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
But the court should serve everyone.
That's right.
And it's not to say that they don't,
Mm-hmm.
because they are of a different nationality or partisan belief or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The matters will be that will serve. But I think it's major.
Mm-hmm.
It's major.
Yeah.
And so that's one of those obstacles that it's moving.
Mm-hmm.
Because we want the best jurists, not based on color, not based on age, not based,
Yeah.
but based on those obviously
Mm-hmm.
required things like knowledge base, education.
Yeah. Well, someone mentioned it a while ago, that the judges come from the society, right? And then the judges reflect what society, the composition of it, but also the societal values. And that's an important thing to consider, because judges do not live and act in a vacuum, right? And then as a part of that independence and impartiality thing, how do you disconnect yourself, and do you disconnect yourself from your familial bonds or your friendships or your political associations or memberships in the political parties and so forth? There's so many things, there's so many bubbles that we're connected to. As an individual, you're affected by that, right? Say in some society, if a family member appears in front of you, what do you do? In some societies, we decided that it's not okay for a judge to adjudicate that case. In some other societies, that would be a complete no-no, a disaster, not to adjudicate that case. You kind of have to do, right? You have to help your own. And that creates an interesting dilemma. For a moment, before we open it up, and we're at that moment almost, I wanted to go a little bit in the direction of judicial review and constitutional review, and that's kind of the basis of what we consider judicial independence. We've seen it in Kenya not long ago, the judicial decision that basically vacated the results of the elections, and that becomes important in a variety of different contexts, what a judge and the court can do in a politically charged environment. And then you brought up Poland. Poland that for a long time and is and has been a success on the scale of democracy transitions over the past 20 plus years. But there's this noticeable backsliding that we see in a number of countries that sometimes is attributed to the fact that that institutional underpinning of a democracy, which would be the rule of law and independent judiciary and so forth, is weak or is still developing. And I would like maybe brief comments on that power that the judges have in our system and elsewhere of constitutional review, judicial review, and how that contributes to the status of judge in the society and the independence of the judiciary.
I mean, unlike U.S., Georgian courts of general jurisdiction have no judicial review power. We have constitutional court with this power to review, to declare invalid or unconstitutional legislation or part of this legislation. Although judges of the Court of General Jurisdiction, they are also very powerful because they can review decisions of high-level officials of Georgia and ministries and departments and election cases. I used to be a judge who was presiding over election cases, and when during the Rose Revolution, for instance, the cases we ruled on, we are very decisive in terms of which kind of composition of parliament then we would have. So there's a number of results of election we are declared invalid by courts, and these courts contributed to this process a lot by this time, delivering judgment. So there is, of course, this huge power in hands of judges, and whether constitutional courts or recently Constitutional Court of Georgia, for instance, also ruled on in regards of judicial selection and appointment, and say that if judges have more than 3 years of judgeship experience, they cannot be appointed again for 3 years of probation, so-called. I did not mention today during this conversation that we have in Georgia lifetime appointment, but it is introduced only, it can be introduced only after judge serves 3 years of initial appointment. It's so-called probation trial period for judge, but this rule applies also to experienced judges with 10 years of experience, 15 years, so it doesn't matter. So in Constitutional Court deliver decision, no, it matters. So, and you should, and mandated to Parliament, you should revise your law and redraft it. And we as a project provided technical assistance to the Parliament Legal Committee, and the law was redrafted, and currently in Georgia around 150 judges, sitting judges, they are facing life reappointment because they already have this 3 and more judgeship experience. That's actually this huge power which can be implemented. Of course, it can be, of course, this power can become real only if judges and court systems are independent. Otherwise, we used to have time when Constitutional Court was considered more like in affiliation with the ruling party or executive. So they would never deliver maybe this kind of judgment. So I think that's because the Constitutional Court currently, enjoy this independence institutionally, and independent judges feel independent. So that's why it became possible. And I think it's a success story. And I'm proud that the Constitutional Court delivered this kind of decision. And I would like also courts of general jurisdiction would also implement their power properly. And so that is what I wanted to tell.
We've all heard about why constitutional review is valuable. And many, many countries around the world have it in their constitutions. They give constitutional review to their courts. I think in the context of our panel, it's interesting, and I want to pick up on what the judge just mentioned, whether the courts are in a fit state to exercise that review power independently. And we can think of so many cases where that doesn't happen, or that power is misused.
Mm-hmm.
So think of Venezuela earlier this year, where the court closed down the legislature, seemingly because the government wanted that. So I do want to tell a bit of a story about Kenya, because I'm conscious you wanted us to give examples, so maybe this is my big example. Kenya has, in fact, had election challenges almost every election since it became multi-party in the early 1990s. And I'll tell you very briefly about those, because it's a story of a judiciary becoming more independent.
Mm-hmm.
So the first multi-party election in 1992 was closely contested. The incumbent was said to have won. The loser had been detained, beaten, suffered a stroke, but his party filed a court challenge. And when the highest court eventually heard it, one of the judgments went out of its way to simply mock the challenger as a disabled person wanting to challenge the authority of the president, and concluded that the challenge was invalid because he could no longer sign his name. So that's how bad things were to begin with. The next election, again, it was disputed, and a challenge was brought. In the end, the courts dismissed it after long delays, when, of course, the government had set up again. Courts dismissed it because the papers hadn't been properly served on the president. So not a good start. Then there was a peaceful election in 2002, and a constitutional reform process got underway. It stalled. The coalition behind it broke up. there was a very tense election in 2007, which you'll probably all remember. And crucially, what happened there was there wasn't a court challenge because the opposition had given up. It had given up for a variety of reasons. It had given up because of those decisions I told you about. It had given up because weeks before the election, the president had appointed more election commissioners and additional judges. The opposition also gave up because while the results were still coming in, the Chief Justice swore in the president for a new term in the middle of the night. And what followed was they took their protests to the streets. More than 1,000 people died. Communities were torn apart across the country, internal displacement, and the international community intervened. Now, since then, there's been a new constitution, a lot of judicial reforms, which I'm sorry I haven't mentioned yet, but I could talk about, including vetting, better funding, and a stronger council, not concentrating all the power in the Chief Justice. So all those changes were put in place in and around 2010. Then the last election, before this one, 2013, was also very close. The question was whether the now president had achieved 50% the first time around, or there had to be a runoff. It went to the Supreme Court, and that in itself was significant. The same challenger, Raila Odinga, this time had more faith in the courts, so took his case there. He lost. His side was very unhappy with how the case was run, but they nonetheless didn't call for street protests at that point. And this year, I can't say whether the decision was right or not on the evidence, but both the confidence of the court in this time overturning an election because the procedures hadn't been, in its judgment, rigorously followed, and also the perhaps reluctant, but the basic willingness of both sides to collaborate and to now have the rerun, for me, shows that there's a story of improvement there, with the courts gradually becoming not only able but also trusted to exercise this constitutional review power.
And that's a very important point, the trust that the political system and the society need to have in the court system. Before I open it up, just as an example of what happened in Russia in the 90s, when the Constitutional Court did try to exercise its independence, and as a result was shut down, I forgot, Will, for about half a year, I believe, 18 months, even longer. When the new constitution was adopted in 1993, the Constitutional Court was still shut down. When a number of decrees were passed by the executive branch at that point by President Yeltsin, that turned out to be detrimental in the long term, and the court again was not in existence. So it's a tricky situation when you try to assert your judicial independence in a place that is not there yet. And on this note, I'd like to open it up to the questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Mansour, and I am a researcher. And I was very interested in this topic, and I actually have a very specific question that deals with the question of selecting judges. And it was not addressed here, but I think it is a very important contemporary challenge, which is the question of selecting judges by popular vote, which is something that is inherent in the US system and is more controversial seen on the other side of the Atlantic, because democratic principles are important, but may not be very essential when it comes to judicial independence, having expertise in selection of judges, and maybe making a selection of judges that provides for independence when a judge is in office, and making sure that a judge represents not only those that voted for him or her, but actually represents, criteria that were set by a Ministry of Justice, a Department of Justice, or some sort of organization or institution that has more expertise in knowing what a judge should represent.
Thank you. So popular elections.
We used to have elections during Soviet time.
Mm-hmm.
We used to experience election of judges during Soviet time. I mean, but they got elected for 5 years, but not anymore. So, I mean, maybe it's more experience of United States, and it has its pros and cons. I mean, people elect who they respect, or in some instances they are partisan and bipartisan elections, right? In the United States, and candidates can be associated with politicians, and or they need also lots of fundings for election campaigns. And I've heard about these concerns, but I cannot be an expert in this, maybe to give you more input, because Georgia doesn't experience the election of judges. It goes through High Council of Justice, which have pre-established criteria such as competence, integrity, pre-established procedure, background check, gathering information, and then it's about decision-making process. Sometimes it's seems objective. Sometimes it seems less objective, and
Just a very brief comment. So I don't know enough of the history of the US states where judges are elected, but I assume it's very significant the reasons that there were then for setting up the system. And if we're sympathetic to a democratic involvement in the courts, I just wonder if juries aren't enough, because juries involve the public, but in a different way, and in a way where legal expertise is not so essential in finding factual verdicts. So that's the one thing I would say. And the other would be to turn your question around and say, should we only focus on places where judges are elected? Because in fact, in many countries, judges, however they're appointed, will behave politically in the interests of their institution or in the interests of parties. So it's too neat to say those are the obvious politicized systems and others are not.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, and we didn't really get into this issue of common law and jury, which is part of our judicial tradition here, and that's pretty much the democratizing element. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. I'm Jim Michael. I've been looking at judiciaries around the world for a long time. And I've seen a lot of procedures that work one place and don't work in another. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you have been talking about, it seems to me, are the technical aspects of how are judges selected, how is their performance evaluated, how are their budgets created. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these things look very good one place and they work, and it doesn't work somewhere else. And I wonder what thoughts the panel has about the external dimensions of judicial independence. Are people outraged when a judge is interfered with? Mm-hmm. Do the judges themselves have high expectations for their own ethical performance and protecting their independence, or will they be more vulnerable to being pushed around? And I'm thinking about, the World Development Report on governance this year talks about preferences and choices and incentives that influence how political institutions work. And I suggest those same influences affect how judicial institutions work. And I wonder about the non-technical, the psychological, the social pressures and so on that influence judicial independence, and if you have thoughts on that dimension.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador.
I was going to say that perhaps one of the most important aspects of ensuring that all people gain equal access to the administration of justice. No person can tell a judge how to decide a case, regardless of that person's position, their power or influence. The decision of a judge must, I think, be based upon the law and can be changed only by a higher court, whose decision must also be based on the applicable law. So, therefore, an independent judiciary is part of the greater, I think, rule of law system that exists in the United States and as well as in other democratic nations. I think it was the World Bank that said the rule of law prevails where, one, the government itself is bound by the law, and also that every person in society is treated equally under the law. And the human dignity of each individual is recognized and protected by the law. And justice is accessible to all. And that sounds awfully lofty. But accordingly, the rule of law requires a judicial system that is independent, and where courts can interpret and apply those laws and regulations in an impartial, predictable, efficient, and transparent manner. And I think that consistent enforcement, in turn, provides for a stable, underlying stable institutional environment where the long-term consequences of economic decisions can be assessed. Some people argue that the purpose of an independent judiciary is really to somehow limit government power and to protect the rights of individuals. But certain safeguards have to be in place for a court to function independently. Organizationally, the transparency of the appointment process and subsequently the ability of judges to be free from threats to job security or salary enhancement, the ability of the judicial branch to interpret the law without unnecessary interference from other branches of government or any other individual. For example, the Constitution provides that federal judges shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall be stated times received for their services, a compensation which shall not be diminished during the continuance in office, which shall administratively the independence of the judicial budget process from other branches and the transparency of procedures to discipline and remove judges also enhance, I think, the independence of the judiciary. Judicial codes of conduct for U.S. judges and lawyers provide minimum uniform standards for their ethical conduct. So finally, the ability of judges to enforce their rulings through the power to hold violators in contempt of court seals, I think, the independence of the U.S. judiciary. I think the answers are certainly not simple ones, but in those countries that choose to honor that, I think it's the best that we have.
No, thank you, Judge. Yeah, I mean, the question of enforcement, that's a huge one, and we didn't really delve into it, but that's, do you want to briefly comment as well?
Yeah.
Please.
That is a brilliant question. I mean, of course, some procedures work better in one environment and absolutely not acceptable in other environments. So social, political context should be considered. That is why perhaps USAID projects which are implementing in these countries like Georgia also have local staff, a combination of local international staff and analysts. So everything should be analyzed. in some instances, lifetime appointment can work and can be perfect timing to present this as safeguard for judiciary, but maybe country is not ready for this as society. And I don't have, for instance, to myself, but exact question whether Georgia was ready for lifetime appointment. Because from one side, it can be seen that system is going to be closed, and entrance of newcomers and gate as an entrance to the judiciary is going to be closed for years. And whether it's good or not, which kind of consequences, what are long-term consequences, short-term consequences, it should be analyzed carefully. Of course, it's very true that all these contexts should be considered prior to introduce particular rules and procedures. It's very important. It's very difficult. Sometimes you have failure and it does not work, and then you should keep moving and doing something else, something different. Sometimes it's traditions, long traditions like you have in US, like UK has traditions. Germany, UK does not have council for the judiciary. They do not need them as bodies to appoint judges, but it does not mean they do not have judicial independence preserved and safeguarded, of course. So they are one of the leading countries in Europe, but Georgia needs.
It's very brief, but your question seems to be, what can we do generally to get judges to behave judicially, to uphold legal values and the law? And I do have a theory there that I want to put forward, and it's that judges and the legal profession, the bar, need a healthy relationship. I feel that across different countries, where that relationship is healthier, the judiciary will be more independent, because the lawyers, the bar, are the people who go to court for clients and make the arguments they can make based on the law. Why do judges sometimes take the opportunity to bend the law and so on? Well, I think they do that where they simply don't care enough what the wider legal community thinks about them. And for me, that's the reason why in a way it connects with what Judge Todri has just said. One should be careful of very closed systems, and that's why I was talking about the dangers of tapping powers and who controls those, as opposed to open application processes. I think that each community, in the end, we're talking about rule of law culture here. Each community has whatever resources it has. And of course, it's about working in the country to harness those as best possible. But I'm always struck by the local successes where more has been made of what the bar has to offer. So Kenya, for instance, the Kenyan bar is a vigorous part of society which, under one-party rule, was really an area in which politics was kept alive. It then campaigned for vetting, it debates these election cases, and so it supplied some of that momentum. In South Africa, where I come from, the legal profession had a checkered history, but in the 1990s it fully took on board constitutional values. Everyone is engaged in that project. And of course, what the judges do feeds back into that. So their eloquent judgments can then be used. And as a last example, I'll throw out there in Tunisia, I spoke to some judges, and in the civil law system, they have separate courts. They have administrative courts, they have civil courts, and a constitutional court. And people had little trust in the civil courts or in the constitutional courts, which they said had been packed by the dictator's friends. But the administrative courts had run a system with the administrative lawyers in which they had exams, it was competitive, and so the regime took a different approach. It started ignoring the judgments because it wasn't getting the judgments it wanted. So it's just interesting to see where people work together. But of course, I mean, I really agree that one needs in-country insights to work out who those people are and how to harness them.
And incentives were mentioned. I'm sorry, I apologize, I forgot totally, because it should come to incentives to some extent, right? What should be used? I mean, when governments, when is poor political will to do these right things, right? In terms of Georgia, I mean, for instance, it was association agreement with the European Union, visa liberalization, NATO membership, this kind of stuff can be used to pedalize and to kind of to get government more interested. But I came to the idea that when we train judges, judge candidates, lawyers, and other people, I think we need to focus also on a political establishment, because they are coming from, I mean, some of them are football players were in the past, or some of them are well educated maybe, but with no good sense of judicial independence and importance of judicial independence. Even we lawyers, we keep working on this in order to understand it better. We still have lots of questions with no answers. So why should we focus now on politicians as well in a country like Georgia to educate them? But you know, it's very sensitive. You cannot tell Prime Minister, let's go for training or something. But something which, but I know, but that is not, I mean, trainings and education, it should be continuous all the time
Thank
for
you.
everybody. What will focus
Absolutely.
on education or political
Thank you.
establishment?
Yeah.
Those who make decisions on this.
That's a very good point, the political culture and so forth, but also the point about the bar associations is an important one. In the former Soviet Union, the bar association does not bring together the judges and the prosecutors and the defense bar. I mean, there are three separate bodies, and it's a competition between the three. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Lisa Davis from the International Association of Women Judges. And you've mentioned a lot of good factors, very helpful. One that I didn't hear in thinking about working around the world is one way to help guarantee the independence is through judicial solidarity and the different ways that takes its form. Whether it's for judges speaking out when there's pressure on one judge or dismissal of the Chief Justice, or it's working in associations, professional associations, particularly judges' associations. I know from our association that judges like to get together with judges and talk about cases, and they don't feel like they can do that with others in the room. So what are your views on judicial solidarity and the forms that takes? And then finally, I'm glad you mentioned Judge Miles LaGrange about the diversity in the judiciary, because we've talked about how women judges might bring some more independence in the judiciary, because for so long, women and women judges were outside of what we call in the U.S. the good old boy network. And does that diversity coming into the judiciary bring some of those independent voices that we need that are outside of those power groups? Thanks.
Anyone? Yeah.
I can be first, because in Georgia we have Chief Justice woman, which, by the way, attended a year ago a conference of International Women Judges Association you organized in DC here, right? I mean, last year. And we have majority of judges are women. Although top leadership position within judiciary are taken by men, I mean judges. So, and the majority of High Council of Justice members elected by majority of women are men. So, I mean, we are looking through the reasons why it's happening, so it should be carefully analyzed. So women are in majority, and they elect men to High Council of Justice. So, I mean, judicial associations is very important. We have in Georgia law, we call it larger, bigger judicial association, which unites all judges. When you come to bench, you should sign this membership letter, and you automatically member. You pay, fees for this. And this association, I mean, does not need lots of efforts to put, because they have representatives at High Council of Justice. They are like political majority, like ruling party. So they unite everybody, and their interests are presented at the High Council of Justice. But recently in Georgia was established so-called alternative judicial association. Thank you. All right. So, and the alternative smaller judges association was established a couple of years ago, which actually united judges who speak out about problems within judiciary, appointment, not appointment, for instance, misuse of disciplinary proceeding, etc. But the environment, that they were not well accepted by other colleague judges, and they got this kind of conflict between them, and they got like accepted like enemies of other judges. And that is a very sensitive issue, and of course it should be paid attention to these kind of collaborative efforts of judges, unions of judges. Maybe we need a Women's Judges Association to be created, or we need to empower individual judges in order then when they are members of association to get better understanding what solidarity means and how it's powerful, how it can be used to protect themselves. Thank you.
Judge.
Nothing right now.
Well, I'm stepping in, obviously without any of the experience the judges have, but it strikes me that solidarity should be a natural and spontaneous human response to the situation judges find themselves in. They've got very strong common interests. An attack on one will make it easier to attack other judges. But a couple of practical things that make a difference here. One is not only to allow associations in country, but to allow international networking. And increasingly, there's not just travel, but also virtual networking. So we work with the University of Cape Town, which has set up private networks for senior African judges to be in touch. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, it's to protect against some of the bad forms of judicial governance that occur from time to time. So there are all kinds of examples of systems where the Chief Justice has a lot of power, and sometimes because of political reasons, if the Chief Justice is the government's person, and sometimes just for their own reasons, Chief Justices abuse those powers. One can think of the minor disciplinary sanctions, so nothing as dramatic as removal, but often transferring a judge. That can be a powerful way of keeping judges quiet and also, in the end, dividing groups of judges. So in the Tunisian case that I mentioned, one of the reasons the admin court system was so strong is they were all in Tunis. So the administrative judge said to me the constitution should include a clause saying we will only be based in Tunis and can't be sent to a country town. But slightly more seriously, the structural safeguard against that, I think, is to diffuse those powers and most obviously to put them in the hands of a council. And then when it's a judicial council, the judicial seats should be filled through election judges voting for their peers. I think that's a better safeguard than having those councils assembled by the same people who put the Chief Justice in place.
My quick remark is the question of the prestige and the status of judges. If you look in some of the systems, say the former Soviet Union, and the diversity element of the justice sector, where the most powerful and the dominant groups were to go, they would not go to become judges, right? To the prosecutor's office or the law enforcement, maybe the defense bar. The judges, I think, were pretty much, the status of the judges was clear if you were looking at the composition of it. Now, looking at people who are applying to become the judges in various countries, you kind of see that the status is changing because you actually see people from the very powerful positions, former prosecutors going into the judiciary and so forth. And that's an interesting dynamic to keep in mind and consider. On the question of solidarity, I always wonder, how do you, as a judge, how do you lobby? How do you protect your interests? How do you actually represent your interests? And that's an interesting question, right? Because, it's a powerful group of individuals, but who would lobby on your behalf?
There is this kind of well-established or well-known concept that judges cannot speak out on their behalf to protect themselves in public. It does not maybe even look good, but that is why it was mentioned something like when they are associated, they are united in association, when association can speak out for individual judge. Speaker judges also are introduced in some number of courts and judiciaries which also can talk on judges. The most powerful instrument of a judge is his judgment, her judgment. These judgments speak out much louder than other stuff, and if they are well reasoned, if they are they are made and delivered based on truly fair trial, and the judges is well respected. Different judges have different reputations in all countries. I mean, you have bad judges, you have mad judges, you have good judges, and judges with high reputation, judges with low reputation, etc. So that is normal thing. What's happening because judges are part of society, right? The same individuals. So I mean, how better it can be protected is through safeguards, through disciplinary proceeding, in order not to allow to conflict judicial independence with some instruments which can be used to punish judges, like transfer was mentioned, right? So which in Georgia was used in the past. Now these rules kind of revisioned and revised properly, so they were used as hidden tool to punish unwelcomed or just judges who are not so obedient. They were transferred from one court to another just overnight through decision of High Council of Justice. But I think that's public trust. That is the most powerful instrument. Again, I started with this, for instance, legislators have the power to adopt legislation, executives have money, and judges have public trust, or do not have. So they should have public trust. That is their obligation, to deliver justice and to gain public trust. Otherwise, you could do other job. I mean, there are lots of jobs for lawyers. I mean, that's my opinion. I resigned voluntarily, though, so because I believe that I can contribute better from the other side now.
So we have just enough time for one more question, perhaps, and we'll wrap it up. Yes, Dick.
I'm interested in whether the panel would agree. I think one of the precepts of judicial independence is something that doesn't exist in many places, which is the court controlling the processing and the progress of cases, civil and criminal. In many places, prosecutors still control how cases are calendared, and in other places, lawyers control what happens on civil calendars. And I would ask the panel if you agree with, until the court takes control of that, there is a degree of judicial independence in a sense which is sacrificed, and may relate back to what the moderator was talking about the relative prestige of the various offices involved. I would say, from my experience, the U.S. federal courts have probably proceeded more along these grounds, this direction than many others. But even in the UK and in the U.S., there are just many places where judges almost abdicate control of how cases are processed and when. Thank you.
If I can start, that is perhaps a problem particularly in common law countries, with the judge having the neutral role in the adversarial litigation system. I just wanted to throw something out there again from Kenya. So the experience of Kenyans with procedural maneuvering frustrating substantive justice led to the 2010 constitution in the judiciary chapter specifying that justice shall be done without undue regard for procedural technicalities, which is an unusual provision because it perhaps means that sometimes strict legal procedure doesn't come first. And I think that's an added tool for judges to use. but perhaps where it isn't explicit, it can still be derived from principles of expeditious justice and prosecution. The prosecution in criminal matters can sometimes be forced to proceed by threat of a permanent stay and that sort of thing. So I imagine that judges do have various tools. It's a matter of them working out whether they feel it appropriate to use them. And of course, the best way to do that is for the procedural rules to be rewritten. Various countries are doing that to give judges a case management role. You may have been referring to the 2000 reforms in the UK, which changed things a bit in that direction. So I think it's best if there can be rules that make it clear that this is not a game to be played to the advantage of whoever can sit out the longest delay, which is surprisingly common problem in many developing countries that are more litigious than one might think, but where then local big business will, for instance, abuse their economic power to just freeze things in the courts.
Oh, I just wanted to say something about Rwanda and this issue. And I did a fair amount of work in Rwanda. When they had the second international conference on Rwanda law reform and law revision, that was in 2003. And their objective was to develop a framework that would, for judicial reform in Rwanda, that would be consistent with universal standards of a sound and effective and an independent judiciary. The conference presented recommendations for incorporation in both the Constitution of Rwanda as well as the organic law changes regarding the issues considered by the 2002 working group. I was at that one too. And the participants included delegates from the nation states represented at that 2002 conference, plus delegates, and they had a constitutional provision that is still in effect that mandates that women must fill at least 30% of post in decision-making organs, which presumably includes judges. So they were very creative for the majority of the population. More men were slaughtered in the last genocide than the earlier ones. I just always thought that was very interesting and very very helpful to try to push forward an incredibly difficult set of circumstances that country found itself in. But it seems to still be working, as far as I know. And I wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
About that.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're supposed to end. I would like to thank the panel for an excellent discussion. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you, that was fun.